if the rotated boxes in lesson 1 were the most painful, well, unanimously voted most painful exercise in the lesson, lessons 2's equivalent is the form intersections, and that's what we'll be dealing with here. So there's a few important things to realize before we start. And first of all, that's that this exercise is naturally difficult. Secondly, the intersections themselves between the forms are not the focus. Instead, we want to focus on just being able to get a bunch of forms that feel like they cohesively and consistently occupy the same three-dimensional space. We don't want to have a bunch of forms that feel like their scales are off or their foreshortening is inconsistent. So one major problem that people will tend to do is they will throw off their, they'll have like a box that has very, box that has extremely dramatic foreshortening. And then they'll place it next to a box that has rather shallow foreshortening. And this is actually something that we tackled in the organic perspective boxes video from lesson 1, where I just mentioned that it's best when you have a lot of these forms together to keep your foreshortening relatively shallow, because otherwise you end up with a very weird and inconsistent sense of scale. So these two forms together, something feels a little bit off, especially if they're overlapping. But one last recommendation that I have is to use primarily equilateral forms. What that means is that I prefer not to see any overly stretched forms, like forms that are very long in one dimension. We want to keep them roughly the same kind of the same size in every dimension. Because when we start doing this, on its own it's fine. But when you start to worry about the extra kind of foreshortening that comes into play when you have a lot of stretching of forms, it really just takes a difficult exercise and makes it more difficult. And like I've mentioned before, when we throw that into the mix, when we make things more difficult than they need to be, we distract ourselves from the main thing that we want to be focusing on. So we essentially take the exercise and make it less effective. So the basic idea of this exercise is that we draw a bunch of forms on the page. It's one page per attempt at the exercise, and we want to fill up the whole page with as many different forms as we can. Once the page is filled with forms, we then start looking into how these overlapping forms intersect with each other. That part is kind of extra, it's difficult, and I don't necessarily expect everyone to fully understand how these forms will intersect with each other just yet. I just want you to give it a shot, because it's a good way to get your brain kind of thinking about these interactions in 3D space. And just like the rotated boxes and the organic perspective boxes and even the 250 box challenge kind of got you thinking about 3D space in a different way, this furthers that and keeps you on that road. And also make sure that you have completed the 250 box challenge before attempting this. If you don't, you may end up experiencing a fair bit of extra difficulty. So let's start with a simple box. And remember, we want to keep the foreshortening fairly shallow, like not so shallow that our perspective starts being horribly wrong, but and of course, since we are eyeballing our perspective, there is likely to be some mistakes, unintentional mistakes, but that's just the way things are. And with practice, they will diminish. That's kind of weird. So we have a box. Next, let's throw in another form. How about a pyramid? So I haven't actually explained how to approach drawing a pyramid or a cone in the past. They're pretty straightforward. So we can start off by drawing a simple flat plane. And the next step that we want to, this is actually slightly off, should be more like this. The next step is that we want to draw across from diagonal to diagonal so that we can find the center of the plane in perspective. That's this point here where they intersect. Because as a plane moves around in 3D, we can no longer simply just measure out the center point of each edge like we would be able to do in 2 dimensions. Because of perspective, those measurements are now distorted. So this technique where you draw an X across the plane from diagonal to diagonal and find the midpoint allows you to identify where the center of that point is going to be. And now we can draw a line out from that center, moving back in 3D space or forwards to basically it'll be a line that is perpendicular to the plane itself. And this point will end where we want the top of our pyramid to be. And we can just draw lines back to each corner from that line. And just like you likely read in the 250 box challenge page, it's very important that you draw through all of your forms because this really helps you to better understand how each form sits in 3D space. So next, let's draw a cone, which uses the exact same principle, where you've got an ellipse, and you find the minor axis of that ellipse. The minor axis is essentially going to it's going to be perpendicular to the ellipse. So same idea here, where it's perpendicular to the plane, it's coming out directly from that ellipse. And so we can do the same thing where we just draw from the point or from the end to the sides of the ellipse, and you get a cone. And now these forms aren't overlapping, so we do want to have some healthy overlap between them. So let's throw in some more boxes. So let's do something a little bit more angled. And what else? Oh yeah, we haven't done a sphere. Spheres are tricky because they basically have to be, I'm going to get rid of this extra text. The spheres have to essentially be big near perfect circles. I mean, it's ideal if they are perfect. And perfect circles are hard to draw. So definitely be sure to apply the ghosting method, as you should be everywhere. And don't forget to draw through your ellipses. That was kind of a messy attempt, but what are you going to do? Oh yeah, we're missing cylinders as well. So let's try that. I prefer to draw my cylinders by starting with a minor axis line. And then we align both ellipses to it. If you've read oh, that's gonna be too stretched. If you've read through the 250 cylinder challenge, you'll remember that the end that faces towards us should have a slightly smaller degree than the end that faces away from us. And for good measure, let's add there's not much overlap here or here, so I want to draw a couple more forms. Of course, you would be filling up the page entirely. I just want to keep this video as short as possible. And then one more cylinder here, I guess. Whoops. There's no real reason for me to keep these on different layers, but just figured I'd be a little bit tidier in case I wanted to use this for another demo. Anyway, so now we've got a bunch of forms drawn in. Now, as far as the exercise goes, I'm pretty happy with this. I'm pretty happy with if a student submitted this to me, I'd be fine with that. The next step is, of course, to look into the actual intersections, which are a side problem, and I encourage you to give them a shot. But they're not super important, so if you find them very difficult or make mistakes, it's perfectly normal. So let's explore those intersections. For the sake of this demo, I'm just going to turn down the opacity on this group for a little while. So first, let's look at a relatively simple one, these two boxes. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to decide where they intersect. And it's really a lot of people get confused because they're like, how do I know where they intersect? A lot of it is actually up to you. You make a decision on where a certain part of the intersection is, and then you allow the forms to tell you where the rest is, like how the rest works. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw a line here, which kind of denotes the intersection between this box and, well, this plane here, this one, and this one. And we're following along the surface of this form here, which is why that is oriented in that fashion. So when we're over here, this box is in front. But as soon as we reach this point here, the back box, this one here, cuts in front of this forward one because they're occupying the same space. So what an intersection essentially is where where the two boxes are kind of vying for dominance, vying for who is in front of the other. And while in general this one is in front of this one, there are places where that changes. So here we are following along the edge of this box. and then this one kind of takes over again. So it's a fairly small intersection. And one great thing about line weight is that line weight can be used to clarify which form is in front of another form. It's basically the main thing that it does. And what I don't want to see is people thinking that, well, if I'm applying line weight to a line, it needs to be on the entire line consistently, like that. That's not the case. Line weight is applied locally to a part of a line to show how that section of the line overlaps another form. So if we wanted to add a little bit of extra line weight here, that would be perfectly okay, where we would kind of taper it off into being more uniform again. Secondly, I do not want to see any sort of cleaning up your lines. That is, replacing the existing line work that you already drew with kind of like a cleanup pass. I don't want to see any of that. I don't want to see lines getting replaced. The only thing that you're doing is applying line weight to emphasize and clarify the lines that already exist. I don't want to see someone trying to then go over here and like clean up this ellipse by going all the way around it with a nice, slow, laborious, wobbly-ass line, because that's just going to undermine the solidity of your forms. And this will be an issue in like future lessons as well. Don't clean up that way, because the problem with it is that it results in your lines, your darker lines, being far less confident, having more wobbling to them, and really just overall undermining the solidity that you had created in your previous pass. Just draw with confidence through the entire thing. So the only reason that this is not at full opacity right now is so that you guys can see what I'm doing better. You guys can see it better, that is. So if I was to be working on this on my own, I would not be lowering the opacity, and certainly you can't do that if you're working traditionally. So next, let's look at this cone and box. This arrow should go away. So similarly, we are going to I'm going to place part of this box in front of the cone, and I'm going to draw this line along the surface of the box, but aligned to the actual base of this cone. So this line here is aligned to the base of the cone, but it's resting on the surface of the box. It's like someone's taken a knife and just carved along the box's surface there. And next, we know that this cone is overlapping the rest of the box because it's sitting in front. And over here, the box is in front once again. So it's a pretty simple intersection cut. Usually when you've got boxes involved, they don't get too difficult. What's quite challenging is when you've got a bunch of rounded forms trying to intersect with each other. Next, let's look at the box and this cylinder. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say that this cylinder is, once again, we're drawing along the surface of the box, but we're following the curvature of the cylinder. And here we're kind of doing the opposite. We're drawing along the surface of the cylinder and following the surface of the box. It's really kind of combining the two surfaces, but here we can see that the cylinder is in front. And it's not because that is inherently what is true with our drawing. That is a decision that we are making with these forms, because it's really up in the air up until we decide to clarify it. Then we've got another intersection here with the ellipse and the cone, or not the cone, the pyramid. And I want to draw along the surface of this pyramid a nice clean cut where we've cut into the cylinder, but since this cut is kind of floating in the middle of the plane, we need to cut back into the cylinder here. Then, as always, we are not drawing a solid black line all the way around the ellipse, just the portion of the ellipse that we need to clarify the fact that this line, which is thicker, is in front of this other form. So now we are left with, I think, two more intersections. The pyramid and the, oh no, three more intersections. The pyramid and the cube, the sphere and the pyramid, and then the sphere and the cylinder. So we'll work our way up. I'm going to draw this. I'm going to cut a line. So we are cutting a line along the surface of the pyramid, I think. Sometimes these intersections also confuse me quite a bit. So at this point, like, you could cast a shadow from underneath the pyramid because it would be sticking out on top. So basically, they only intersect up to here. And then at some point around here, they would kind of resume the intersection. I think. So now we've got the pyramid and the sphere, and this is another one that is quite confusing to me. I like to think of it as, so we've got this plane here coming off of, so this plane here, and we've got the ellipse, the sphere kind of cutting across it. I believe like that. Because the where all these planes of the more planar box-like forms, they have their straight cuts because they are just flat planes. The ellipses, the sphere's cross sections are not flat; they are ellipsoid. Like, you'd be drawing big old ellipse around the surface of the form. So that's why you get an elliptical cut where the rest of these are straight. And for a cylinder going into an ellipse, usually the intersection is going to be yet another ellipse. But in this case, I'm not really sure. I think it would be maybe up here. And that's basically it. Those are all our intersections. So if I were to turn this one up again. So when you're doing this exercise, you would cover the entire page with as many forms as you can. Just don't end up with any forms that are cut off on the side of the page. Like, don't have any of this, or no. this kind of thing going on. Make sure that the entirety of each form is present on the page, but beyond that, try and fit as many in there as you can. Now, the intersections are, like I said like a dozen times now, they are difficult. I still have difficulty with them. But give it a shot, see how it goes, and if it doesn't, don't feel disheartened, because it's pretty normal. And I actually just realized that I interpreted this this cylinder as backwards, because in my mind this was the side that was facing us, but based on the degree of the ellipse, this is actually the face that is pointed towards us. So I definitely screwed that intersection up. Maybe I can actually fix it, because I'm working digitally. So this intersection would be actually more like this, where you're kind of combining the roundedness of two forms, and the sphere is like trying to nibble at this cylinder. I believe that's the way it would work. Not entirely sure though. Something like that. Anyways, there we go. It can help, of course, when you've drawn through all these forms to kind of shade in with simple hatching lines the face that is facing towards the viewer, just for clarity's sake. Because when you're drawing through all these forms to get a better sense of how they all sit through in 3D space, it can get very confusing as to which side is facing you. Just try your best to keep the lines consistent and evenly spaced and parallel, and make sure that they stretch all the way from edge to edge. What's this one? I'm really messing this up. That was a mistake. Anyway, so that's the idea. I hope that helped clarify some things. Remember that this video should not be like viewed on its own. You should be reading through the lesson as well. There's a lot of information there, a lot of detailed explanations, so don't just rely on the videos. I know it's easier to consume videos, but drawing is just too complicated to just deal with one simple form of explanation. So yeah, next one will be the organic intersections.